Why don't you tell us who you are and how you got into this mobility space?
Sure. My name is David Zipper. I am a resident fellow at a think tank called the German Marshall Fund, based in Washington and in Berlin, where I lead the Transatlantic Urban Mobility Initiative, looking at urban mobility innovations and opportunities in American and European cities. And I come to transportation through a sort of idiosyncratic route. I actually focused more on economic development at first, looking at ways of building up the economies in cities in the United States, especially in New York and in Washington when I was in the mayor's office there. And it was then that I started to appreciate that, although at that time really it was incentives and corporate attraction were a real way of growing economies, actually transportation, and particularly having high quality transportation options, was frankly a better economic development approach, in my view, than throwing money at corporate recruitment. And so I happened to be in Washington, D.C. when bike share launched, Capital Bike Share, one of the first in North America, a time when ride hail emerged, and it got me really fired up about the opportunities. And for the last 8 years, I've been focused on learning more about it and supporting what I think is some really positive changes globally in urban mobility, and trying to keep the process moving forward.
What do you see as the biggest game changers on the horizon right now? What do you think the biggest threats are, and what's hype and conjecture versus realistic risks?
And I think what gets me most excited and optimistic about the future with urban transportation is that at long last, I think there is a growing acknowledgement, certainly in sort of big city leaders, but also to an extent, I think, with the general public, that the way we've handled street space and curb space just doesn't make a lot of sense. People recognize that allocating 40% plus of cities to parking for vehicles that are just sitting there unused 95% of the time is just not really rational or the best way of building communities and cities where we want to live. And as we sort of gradually scale back parking, it opens up so much opportunity for new uses, for pedestrians, for bicyclists, for transit, and for new mobility modes that I think are, this whole world of micromobility I think is incredibly exciting, with scooters, electric bikes. I think who knows what's going to come next with these, like, electric unicycles and other things. To me, that I feel like is real. Those new innovations are real. Batteries are getting better. The infrastructure in cities is getting more supportive, so those trips feel safer and are safer. So I think that's real. What I think is, frankly, hype, beyond the obvious candidates like Hyperloop, which I'm going to pursue, is actually autonomous vehicles. I think that people have jumped on the AV bandwagon, at least in terms of personal AV vehicles. And the reality is, in a city that is going to have, in a dense city with variable weather, you are still a long ways away from having the majority of having cars be able to safely provide trips for people in an autonomous vehicle at a level 5 is what the United States calls it, the SAE level. And I think that we're still a long ways away from having widespread adoption of personal AV vehicles. I don't think cities need to focus on that immediately. They do need to focus immediately on micromobility and encouraging it.
Great. You've had a chance to spend some time in Vancouver. We've had a couple conversations, and you gave a keynote yesterday at our January 7th New Mobility Forum. So with a couple days of experience here in this region, what key advice would you give to us in Metro Vancouver?
Well, you've got a lot of power now, right? Because these services aren't here yet, whether it's ride hail or it's scooter share. So you can negotiate, I think, from a position of power, you and then the cities within the TransLink region, on the terms that they come in. So what I would really encourage this region to do, or leaders in this region to do, is be very conscious and deliberate about the goals you want to achieve with these new services coming in. And I think it's good on net that they would be here, but the question is, what do you want them to provide? For example, maybe you want ride hail to provide better access late at night for people who are going out for drinks and shouldn't be driving, and TransLink doesn't offer as much service for those folks who are going to be in downtown areas late at night. Then providing really good TNC drop-off points in nightlife areas makes a lot of sense. At the same time, too, you might say that in more outer-lying parts of the region, where you can't provide the bus service you might otherwise want to because of a lack of density, having TNC partnerships there makes makes sense as well. Where you probably don't need TNCs as much is going to be in the downtown cores in places like Surrey and Vancouver, especially during peak times when the roads are already quite full, and taking steps to mitigate that, perhaps using taxation powers to nudge ride hail toward pooled rides instead of individual rides, to me makes a lot of sense. And then finally, the last point I would make is just to be transparent, not just about what those goals are, but also the thresholds you're using to evaluate the success of these new services as they're deployed. Utilization rates for scooter share and bike share I find to be very, very useful in understanding just how popular and these services are, and whether it makes sense to have more of them on city streets given whatever threshold you may start with, or if you frankly want to scale them back because they just aren't sticking.
Mobility as a service, or MaaS, is a concept which transit agencies, transportation authorities around the world are grappling with right now. We talked about a bunch of that stuff yesterday. Yep. You facilitated a great panel discussion. What do you think are some of the key issues that we need to grapple with? Where do you think this conversation is landing? Where is it going?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of talk about MaaS, but there's not that much that's very clear about it yet. There's not even a clear definition of what it means. You hear so many terms for it, just like the term smart cities for the last few years, where everybody has their own interpretation of it. But I think the way I think of the way to cut through a lot of the hullabaloo around MaaS, in my view, is to focus on the user experience and what a transit agency or a city is trying to achieve with the user experience around urban mobility that achieves social outcomes for the city writ large and improves the individual resident's transportation experience. So in my mind, what that means is having it be really easy for a resident of Richmond or Surrey or whatever to be able to go onto their smartphone and see all the various options they could use to get from wherever they are to wherever they want to go, and be able to not just plan a trip, but book that trip, whether it's on one mode or multiple modes, public or private. And ideally, they can actually buy a basket of transportation goods for a given month, let's say for $75 a month, that they know will allow them to use a variety of modes to get around, whether it's car share, bike share, TransLink services, or potentially ride hail as well. That, first of all, just so to be clear, that's what we're moving toward, or I think we should move toward. Nowhere in the world that I know of has actually really achieved that fully. So for MaaS to be successful, you want to have integrated trip planning and integrated payments for all those modes, both public and private, in one place. And ideally, you'd have subscription services available too, so that for $75 a month or whatever the amount is, you're able to purchase a basket of mobility goods, and you can use that subscription to travel however you want to. No one has really pulled that off yet. There's some cities that have tried or are trying, exploring it. Singapore, Antwerp, Helsinki is another example, Birmingham, England. But it's very early days. And if that's a vision that TransLink wants to pursue, and I think it's worth pursuing, there's steps to get there along the way. And part of it is building in open trip planning and open payment information and data so that it's at least possible to pull all of this kind of information together into one place. For example, right now, you can't buy a TransLink ticket on another provider, whether it's a car share service or another sort of company like that. Maybe you want to think about making that possible. But there's various steps you can take to, again, pull more and more services together to make the entire network more interoperable. Just a couple days ago, I took one of your ferry services to get to Granville Island, and I noticed that it wasn't on part of Compass. Okay, that makes sense, but maybe it should be. Maybe that's a step that would be positive in the direction toward pursuing MaaS.
So what do you think about the rise of shared mobility options in terms of their capacity to potentially reduce the use of personal single-occupant vehicles in a significant way?
I think that alternative modes of transport, and in my mind I think of electric scooters, electric bikes, which could be shared, but it could also be personally owned, and ride hail fits into this too. They're gonna be around for the long haul, because some of these modes are just more fun. If you've tried an electric scooter before, I think you'll know what I mean. They're just fun, even if you might think people look dorky on them, which many do. So those services are not gonna go away. But whether they really catch on in a way that allows them to dent the percentage of people who are traveling or driving themselves alone when they commute, I think that has a lot to do not so much with the appeal of these new services, but rather the way that we treat parking and the way that we treat taxes. Are we going to start imposing congestion taxes on people who drive? Are we going to start stripping away some of the parking spots that are taking up some of those valuable pieces of property in downtown Vancouver and in cities across the world? If we start doing that, then that's actually going to be a little bit of a nudge, or potentially more than a little nudge, for people to say, maybe I don't want to be driving myself everywhere. Maybe I want to find alternative modes of transportation. And by the way, it could be those private modes we've talked about, or it could be public transit. But we can't delude ourselves into thinking that regulation and taxation and treatment of parking are not absolutely critical in terms of shaping decisions of how people travel, and also whether or not they're going to purchase a private vehicle.
Are the rise of private transportation providers and this whole new ecosystem of sort of shared use mobility, do you think that's a threat to public transit in your view, or are they complementary?
I think it's both. I think that there are definite opportunities where even a service like ride hail that I think strikes fear in the hearts of many transit leaders can be hugely advantageous. It's very expensive to run a bus late at night with 2 people on it, and it's a bad user experience because you're having to wait a long time for that bus, and it's probably not picking you up exactly where you are, dropping you off exactly where you want to be. Why not have that transit agency, instead of providing that bus that's really expensive and has it to be subsidized in a big way, why not instead pay for a ride hail or a service like that to move that passenger, give them a better user experience, and actually save some money in the transit agency's operating ledger. So that's an opportunity. I think the real threat is when you think about the enhanced congestion that ride hail in particular can create in downtown areas. If that's going to slow down the bus speeds that you're going to see in a place like Vancouver, that's a huge problem. It could drive people away from using the bus. That's why I think bus rapid transit lanes that are dedicated are really, really important, not just here but everywhere. And I guess the last point I'd make is perhaps the most obvious one, which is, of course, there's going to be some competition with ride hail when it comes here in transit. You know, people will recognize that they could take ride hail instead of a bus or instead of SkyTrain, but that actually could be constructive and helpful to provide that sort of a nudge to improve service. I've seen that happen in other cities and transit agencies around the country. So I don't think that simply saying, oh, look, there's another mode that people might choose other than transit is in and of itself a good enough reason to be opposed to its arrival. I think on net, it should be a good thing if it's handled in a thoughtful manner ex ante.
Okay, well, we'll have to follow up with you again in a year. We'll do another interview, and you can see how things are going when ride hailing arrives here.
I will look forward to it.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks, David, so much for your time. It's been great to have you here in Vancouver.
It's been a real pleasure, and I hope we'll be back again soon.
Sounds good.
Thanks, Andrew.
See you soon.